So hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this very jet-lagged 9:30 in the morning talk. This is Gifts of the Grandfather, Warhammer's Plague Narratives from the perspective of an epidemiologist. So who am I? Which is a good sort of context for this talk. I'm an associate professor at Washington State University in the United States in the Paul G. Allen School for Global Health, and I work as what we call a computational epidemiologist, which is basically I make little computer war games where people get sick. Normally I work on relaxing things like emerging infectious diseases and healthcare-associated infections. Relevant for this talk, I'm also a fellow for the Society for Healthcare Epidemiology of America, which are the people who try to keep you from getting sick when you go to the hospital. And this is sort of part of a parallel research side hustle, which is a term I've discovered horrifies the Europeans, that has been about the use of sort of serious games, popular media, and things like that in both scholarship and teaching, especially around epidemiology and infectious diseases. I am also, unsurprisingly, a fan of Warhammer. Adeptus Titanicus is God's most perfect game. Primarily at the moment, I play a lot of Heresy, but I do have an Eldar army sitting around there somewhere. This is my lamentably now very illegal Autarch. So to start with, sort of, why are we thinking about plague narratives generally? The use of disease is widespread in literature and storytelling. This can be used for a bunch of different purposes, including, plague as an instrument of divine wrath, see the Bible, to an inescapable reminder of mortality. So something like the Mask of the Red Death. It's just like, no, you can't hide. There's no amount of wealth that will stop infectious disease from eventually finding you. Sometimes it's merely the backdrop. It's an external pressure that provides the motivating force for things. Zombie narratives are often this, is like what you're actually talking about is, man's inhumanity to man, but in the meantime, there's a bunch of things in the woods that are going to eat you. And Jürgen Reiber Christensen wrote a very short paper that I thought was really interesting called The Formula of Plague Narratives that takes a sample of plague literature and says, what are the elements that most commonly appear in our stories about infectious diseases? And 5 of the most frequently occurring elements were the number of dead, makes sense, the source of the pestilence, a description of symptoms, the role of physicians, and official measures. These are all things my field worries about all the time anyway. So I thought it was sort of an interesting idea to take a look at these narratives from the perspective of an epidemiologist. A colleague of mine, Nina Pfefferman, who's actually on the call, and I have done this with Journal of the Plague Year by Defoe. It's like, okay, from an epidemiological perspective, how much does this make sense? So within Warhammer, they're all over the place. The most obvious one is Nurgle, is one of the quote-unquote big 4 chaos gods and his assembly of demons, mortal followers, etc., etc. But we're not actually going to talk about Nurgle all that much because space magic with a veneer of disease on it isn't terribly interesting to me. And that's where a lot of Nurgle rests, is just like magic disease that does things because we need it to. So instead, we're going to look at some other things where it is nevertheless baked into the setting. So the sort of famous introduction to the Space Marines that, they shall be my finest warriors, and this ends with, and they shall know no fear. In the middle of that is they will be untouched by plague or disease, no sickness shall blight them. Importantly, this comes before tactics. So first is power armor and vultures, second is they won't get sick, third is that they'll be good at their jobs. That is perhaps the priority. This seems like hubris given at this point in the storyline. The improved mankind knows Nurgle exists. And yeah, terms and conditions definitely apply to this one. This is an aspirational statement, as it turns out. So this talk is sort of a play in 3 acts looking at different scales for plague narratives in Warhammer. The first is a personal plague narrative. This is one person and their interaction with infections. There's a battlefield plague narrative, so this is sort of a theater level look at infectious diseases in Warhammer. And the final one is a planetary scale plague narrative. The disclaimer is there are very minor spoilers for Wolfsbane and Dark Imperium, and I suppose also Flight of the Eisenstein. If you haven't read those, you've had decades, so I'm sorry. So Act 1 is a personal plague narrative, or in the grim darkness of the far future, there are only skin and soft tissue infections. So one of the things that comes up in Wolfsbane, which is this book where we first meet the character of Belisarius Cawl temporally. Essentially, they came out with this really cool model for the Primaris Marines. They did this whole introduction, and they went, wait, this guy's been in the setting for a long time. We need to work him into the setting. So they had Guy Haley in a book called Wolfsbane introduce him as a young tech priest. And there's a scene where he's talking to another tech priest about how ridiculous all the augmetics that the Adeptus Mechanicus goes through. And his friend is defending his ocular implants. And he says, there's the low right spectral site, the dark side, I can see in the dark, I can do all this cool stuff. And Call asks, but what has this really brought you anyway, apart from a succession of fungal infections? And this is the first time I remember reading a Black Library book that was like, yeah, all these surgical implants we have, like, are probably a bad idea. And they are connected to your skin, and it turns out we're not very good at surgery 40,000 years from now, and they're just sort of gross. And then similarly, in another section where Cole is literally essentially installing a USB stick for his brain, it talks about there's this hole in his head, and it's filled with aseptic gels to keep it free of disease, and he doesn't want to put his hood over his head because it'll move the sterile patch that's covering the hole. And I was like, this is literally the first time where anyone has been fastidious about infection control in Warhammer at all. This immediately endeared me to Guy Haley because I thought this was this really interesting sort of take on being meticulous and careful in things that the Mechanicus is not normally known for, that sort of do play on things that we are genuinely worried about as humans. So like, one of the things that keeps your brain safe, because your brain doesn't have much of an immune system, is what's called the blood-brain barrier. If you're sticking things directly into your head, you are skipping the blood-brain barrier, and that's sort of terrifying. Augmetics, enhancements, limb replacements are everywhere in Warhammer 40K. And in our world, the interface between your skin and something like a prosthetic is a very high-risk area for infections and something we are working on constantly, trying to figure out how to prevent them, and lamentably have gotten quite good at it after the global war on terror. And so these things like sterile procedure, concerns about disinfection, things like that, go almost completely unmentioned in 40K plague narratives, except ironically in painting advice. Often when you see painting guides to how to paint augmetics and stuff, there's a suggestion that around the augmetic you use this sort of light red glaze to get that pinkish inflamed skin. That is something that will eventually give your poor toy soldier sepsis. And really nothing touches on that. And I just sort of pulled these sort of last night things. You have sort of, canonically, you have, you know, arcoflagellants and things like that. This guy's got skin irritation around both of the flails that were once his arms. All of the little cuts and wounds he has are infected. Like, if you're going to build a biomechanical assassin, they probably shouldn't get sick and die of like ordinary infections. You have this extremely unhealthy looking augmetic. Like, this is bad. And then similarly, you have just the classic Space Marines. Space Marines are sticking all kinds of things into them. They've got, you know, the service studs bonded to their skulls. They've got implants for the black carapace. Very little time is spent on trying to keep this clean. And the sort of extreme version of this is something like the Sisters Repentia, where they've both got those sort of implants for the power armor they've chosen not to wear. They've got things stuck through them, like all kinds of things. They're all going to die of sepsis well before they die from battle, and that is not, generally speaking, the goal. So Act 2 is this idea of a battlefield plague narrative. So looking at sort of the wider sort of 40K universe, and we find ourselves reading another Guy Haley book, Dark Imperium, where we find ourselves on Iax, which is a world in the Ultramar sector, which has been converted to a hospital world, taking in casualties from a frontline war between the Ultramarines and the Death Guard. What follows is an entire chapter on quarantine and decontamination procedure. Guy Haley is at this point writing books for me and me alone, and then everybody else gets, you know, bolters and plague marines and stuff like that, but this chapter is mine. And it touches on a number of themes. One is this idea of sort of procedural themes around infection control. So my favorite is, like everything in Ultramar, if a job were deemed enough importance to be done, then it would be done correctly. This is, I think, possibly the most optimistic line ever written about the Imperium, and indeed makes me sort of have a wistful sigh, because this is not how public health is currently treated. And you get other things. So, for example, the Surgeon General of Iax would have preferred a bunch of this be done in orbit, but time is a factor. And this comes up in things like hospital infection control, with if we discharge you from a room, we'd really like to clean it very, very thoroughly, but in the meantime, there's also a waiting list for people to get into that room, and you have to sort of balance those concerns. Besides, propaganda had its role to play. These ships were not serious vectors of infection. We're hosing down these ships with these very visible plumes of steam and things like that, mostly to make everybody feel good about this. As we look back on the sort of COVID-19 pandemic, things like, are you washing your apples in bleach, come into this sort of, this is largely to make people feel reassured and that this feels very important, but this has been left to low-level servitors because this is just essentially a hose with bleach. There are some other themes that come in that are very familiar to people who work in public health, the difficulties of coordination and supply. So these shuttles are the responsibility, they're essentially shuttling wounded people down to the planet for treatment. When they're in the air, they're the responsibility of the Navy. When they land, they're responsibility of the people on the ground. So there's some fights about whose problem it is when they're like mid-air, or if you don't want them to send down, can you say that? A number of different people have to sign off on that, like, yes, we think this is secure, good job for us. And then there's simply not enough ships to separate the sick from the injured. So the transport ships that are bringing the wounded to this planet have a mixture of everything from really this person has been like hugged by plague marines and is doomed to like minor battlefield injuries. They're all in the same ship, so they have picked up infections along the way, and those infections range from the mundane to the supernatural, which brings us to this notion of varying levels of severity. So descriptions of disease and sort of how they go. Some of these diseases can be treated by like quarantines and normal medicine, like space penicillin. Others required specialist care. In the real world, we call this intensive care units. Here, we call a priest to exorcise you. The efficacy of that is left as an exercise to the reader. And you can have specialty wards, which we have in the United States, for example. We have a number of hospitals that handle special pathogens in particular regions. Here, there's a whole spaceship. There's a whole orbital that the answer is like, if we think you're really in trouble, you go there. And what happens to you afterwards is unpleasant. And then we split the sick into unknown and known pathogen groups. We try to divide you. This is all stuff that essentially has a veneer of grimdark over what we actually do. And finally, we have sort of the role of epidemiology in defense. So Reboot Gilliman has this very 40K line: by the preservation of life do we maintain our capability to mete out death. That is not what the Department of Defense feels about public health. The history of public health, essentially until very recently, has been how do we keep as many soldiers from dying from disease so that they can kill other people. So if you look at a lot of the malaria control efforts in the United States, it comes out of our various wars in the tropics, things like that. And so this resonates rather well. And finally, there is the inherent final failure of infection control, which is that there's a brief squirming, maggoty motion. This is obviously space magic because that would be agonizing if it actually happened to you. And then it vanishes into his ribs, never to be seen again until this poor guy named Bolus gets turned into a plague bearer. This is actually my research agenda, is what happens when infection control fails during emerging infectious diseases, and that you have essentially brought very sick people to a concentrated place full of other sick people and healthcare workers, and eventually some mistake will occur. That is a huge amount of my research agenda, so this is me in 40K. So why does this matter? And I think one of the things for this is narratively, this sets up the Death Guard as a serious foe. Infections get onto IACS despite this protocol. Like, the Imperium is trying its best. It's actually doing a pretty good job. And this is in contrast to a lot of narratives in 40K where somebody, often the Imperium, has to be holding what I refer to as the idiot ball for the story to progress. That, you know, the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves both can't use their adult words, and so they get into a shooting fight. Whereas this is like, no, we tried, we really did our best, and it just failed anyway. This also establishes the competency of the Ultramarine administration, is that, like, no, we have systems in place, those systems are logical, they read well, etc. And it only asks the reader to suspend their disbelief for the supernatural, not the mundane. You have to accept that there's something living in the sky squirming around, but that's all we ask you to accept, which I think is nice for sort of budgeting your reader's ability to just overlook things because it's cool because there's bolters involved. Extending this further and broadening beyond just Warhammer fiction, though not abandoning it, these types of narratives provide opportunities for different stories. One of the primary appeals of contagion in literature, and one of its primary challenges in life, is that diseases are insidious. And I argue this is more compelling if you show defeating genuine attempts to thwart disease rather than just sort of letting it skate through. The reason there's a tank here is that when I discuss zombie narratives with people, one of the very common things is, oh, I just run them over with a tank. And on the surface, seems like a reasonable plan, except this is a very muddy tank. We have now, thanks to the conflict in Ukraine, seen a lot of very muddy tanks. Tanks need to be cleaned. If this is not mud, but mud and zombie guts, and the zombie bits are infectious, how do you clean the treads off a tank? When you hose it down, where does that water go? Where does the water you're drinking get drawn from? Are those the same place? And so you can have these sort of extended questions about your sort of setting by giving it a degree of verisimilitude, and then you have very insidious things like, yes, you know, we got another settlement sick because we don't know about the watershed, rather than like the zombies broke through the wall again. So finally, we have a planetary plague narrative, and this is where things go a little bit off the rails. We're going to talk about the Life Eater virus. This is one of the classic Imperium Exterminatus protocols. This is usually deployed via bombardment, rather quote-unquote famously on Isstvan 3. This causes a rapid decay of all exposed organic matter. This is a picture of it accidentally being released on a frigate called the Eisenstein. All of these dudes die except for the Death Guard in back, and he turns into a demon. This then fills the atmosphere with methane gas from the decaying organic stuff, and as a secondary attack, this can trigger a firestorm. So basically, everything melts, it turns into gas, you zap it with a lance, and there's a firestorm. This is, to be blunt, absolutely nonsensical. And it more closely represents what people think of as a chemical weapon than a biological one, but this one infuriates me. A brief introduction to how the simplest of all viruses work. Basically, you have a virus, it finds a host cell, it binds to it, it injects its DNA or RNA inside. This hijacks the cellular mechanisms that are used to duplicate the genetic material to produce tiny little baby viruses. Eventually, those fill the cell and the cell ruptures, sending out more viruses. This is how, like, the most simple version of viruses work. There's all kinds of caveats to this in a whole field called virology. But that binding part, where it actually attaches, to bind to a host cell and then enter it, a virus needs a receptor on the outside of the cell. This is usually a protein sticking out of the cell membrane that it can grab onto. If you're familiar with something like H5N1 influenza or H1 influenza, the H is hemagglutinin, which is a receptor that sits on the outside of cells doing perfectly normal things, and then viruses bind to it. The Life Eater virus posits a genuinely universal viral receptor. Also that genuinely universal way genetic material is handled, et cetera, et cetera. And that means the very same thing has to exist for trees, bacterias, people, Eldar, and orcs with their famously triple helixed DNA. So somehow over the entire span of the galaxy, everybody has the same receptor somewhere on their cell. That's not real. It's just not. And similarly, even if that did exist, a receptor stable enough to apply to all life that has worked for over 10,000 years or potentially longer on evolutionary timescales is also the perfect vaccine target, because like this protein is just sitting out there, stable, everywhere, wonderful. Vaccines are generally speaking easier to develop than custom-tailored bioweapons. Any society capable of engineering the Life Eater virus is capable of producing a vaccine for it. The Imperium might not have done this because I don't know the anti-vaccination status of the Imperium, but it could be quite high. But like, you can't tell me the Eldari wouldn't and just be like, yeah, it's cute humans, you brought this planet-killing weapon, but no, we have a pill against that. That feels like an extremely Eldari thing to do. The whole instant decay thing is also a problem. Viruses can be fast, but they're not dissolve in your suit fast. Viruses, even very fast-acting ones, like the ones that cause food poisoning on cruise ships, work on the span of hours. In the narrative for the virus bombing of Isstvan 3, it kills everyone on the planet in like 8 minutes. That's ridiculous. Decay without bacteria, insects, various scavengers, things like that is actually pretty slow, and you've killed everything that can help the decay process by deploying life eater virus. This is also very bad for transmission to kill your host very fast. In fairness, this is less of a problem because you're being bombarded with the virus, but yeah. On the planetary firestorm thing. Right now on Earth, if someone virus bombed to the Earth, there's about 550 gigatons of carbon in the biomass of Earth. Most of it's in plants. There have been studies on sort of the various temperature and atmospheric compositions of Earth, and there have been releases of methane estimated at 4,700 gigatons of carbon in the past. This was like an ecological catastrophe for life on the planet, but obviously our atmosphere didn't ignite. There was no planet sterilizing firestorm from this, so you're now at like many orders of magnitude more biomass necessary for this than could happen. And then the final question is also just why? If you want to incinerate a planet, we have ample conventional means of incinerating a planet on hand, especially in the 40K universe, where the average space fleet is carrying around enough firepower to destroy a planet. The threat behind biological weapons tends to be targeting. So a very species-specific disease. We're going to introduce a cattle disease into your economy that depends on cattle. The desire to leave infrastructure intact. All of you are dead, your stuff is fine. Or the ability to have a single source of introduction spread the disease widely. So we only have to do this sort of once in a small place, and then hopefully it will spread and cause much larger devastation. The life eater virus accomplishes none of these things. And instead, you've just turned it into a bomb with more work. Like if you have to trigger that firestorm with a lance strike, why not just use the massive laser beam to blow things up in the first place? Why do I care about this? Besides this being a Warhammer conference and I need something to talk about, so I'm going to rant about the life eater virus for a bit. In contrast to the sort of quarantine procedures on IAX, I'd argue that the life eater virus deprives writers in the settings of options. We already have a bunch of ways to destroy a planet. We have cyclonic torpedoes and lance strikes, and we can, tow asteroids into orbit and things like that. What we don't have is an exterminatus weapon that is slow and unrelenting. Sort of imagine the sort of setting appropriate terror of an inquisitor declaring your planet to be subject to exterminatus, leaving a canister in a hive city and going, okay, we'll be back in 100 years. And just, your planet has been left to die horribly over time. That's terrible. We have deprived ourselves of the ability to do that by going, oh, virus bombardment is fast and ends in a firestorm. And so basically you took a perfectly good virus and turned it into yet another space magic bomb, and that makes me sort of sad. So that's it. Thank you all very much. My contact information is eric.lofgren@wsu.edu. I'm on Blue Sky at either Variance Hammer, that's my hobby account, or at Germs and Numbers, that's me being a professional. Some of this was indeed funded by an NSF-funded Center of the Analysis and Prediction of Pandemic Expansion Center. I also want to thank JD from the Age of Darkness podcast for once indulging me about ranting about the life eater virus on his podcast for a bit. And yeah, other things I do is I'm one of the hosts for the Lost to the Nails podcast, which says it's a 40K podcast. It's now mostly a 30K podcast. And I occasionally write for Goonhammer Historicals. Thank you all very much.